Hello, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 9 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading The Power of Myth, a conversation between the mythologist Joseph Campbell and the journalist Bill Moyers. And that is the last time I think I will ever say that on this podcast, because this is the last episode of Season 3. This time we're covering the final chapter in this book, The Masks of Eternity. An interesting chapter all about God and belief systems and faith and all kinds of topics kind of crammed into one here, I thought.
Yes.
Wonderful insight. Thank you for that. What do you think of this chapter overall? Because I feel like we'll have some opinions about what Campbell has to say in this one.
He has a little bit more references than last page to actual last chapter to actual mythology and mythological thinking. And again, he's kind of on this kick about we're all part of the same being. Mm-hmm. You am I am you. We're all us, and that kind of stuff. So he's got that. It's kind of funny because it's a discussion. I thought it'd be more discussion of mythology as opposed to his personal philosophy in the book at the beginning, and then it seems to have kind of gone over time to. Now we're just talking about Joseph Campbell's religious beliefs.
Mm-hmm. I mean, more or less, yeah. But I think it is... I mean, I don't think it's entirely removed from mythology, of course. I think it's...
Well, he is a mythologist.
Yes. But I think it's a reasonable place to come to at the end of this. You know, he sets up, why is mythology important? And then from there, how he applies mythology to his own life.
True.
I mean, eventually...
That's a good last chapter, I guess.
Yeah. Eventually, what are you going to discuss? I mean, you can't just keep it impersonal forever when you're talking about, like, faith and mythology and religion.
You can.
You can. I'm sorry. You're correct. All right. So he starts off with this discussion about wonder. He says, every culture agrees that there is something beyond the world of the senses, a mystery to wonder at. He says, we symbolize different aspects of life in different ways, but the source of these aspects remains a mystery in every culture. And goes on to say, we don't need to have faith, we need to have the experience of wonder to view the energies of life as divinities. He kind of represents that as the devil and the angel on the shoulder. So really what he's saying here is we all just wonder about the nature of things, and then we represent all these different aspects of the nature of things in different ways and different divinities, but it all comes from that sense of wonder, that sense of the mystery of something beyond, and that's where we get all of these different divinities that we have created.
You've used the word wonder like 5 times, and I didn't make a note that he used the word wonder at all.
He did, I believe.
Does he?
He does. I think like on the very first page.
It talks about man's tendency to anthropomorphize natural forces and how he doesn't have faith, he has experience.
Yes, he says, I have experience of the wonder of life. And then from there, he goes into the different categories of wonder of life. So really, I think it all goes back to him saying, it's wondering what more there is. I've summarized, of course, what he's saying here, because he uses a bunch of different examples. But I think it's what he's really saying is that the reason we have all these different divinities is because we have that initial wonder about things beyond our understanding.
All right.
And he says that the source of these sort of divinities that we create, these energies, these come from our body's energy, which comes from the ultimate energy of the universe, which we describe as God. And then he has...
Do you buy that?
I don't.
Why not?
Well, actually, I think Moyers asked the right question. I was about to read this section here on page 261.
So start reading the book.
All right.
261?
Yes. Moyers asks, but if God is the God we have only imagined, how can we stand in awe of our own creation? And Campbell responds, how can we be terrified by a dream? You have to break past your image of God to get through to the connoted illumination. The psychologist Jung has a relevant saying, religion is a defense against the experience of God. And I don't think Campbell really answers that question too properly there. I think Moyers is spot on in asking that question. I think Moyers did a really good job in this chapter of asking some of the right questions, but I think it's it all kind of falls apart, because if we're looking at something that's so beyond our own world and our own imagination, how can that possibly be something that we have ourselves imagined, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I don't think that's exactly what he's saying, though. He's saying that he's not saying God's a creation of our imagination. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think that is what he's saying.
No.
You don't think so?
I don't think so. I think he's talking about how do you achieve understanding and of your own self and of being, and your true being and following your bliss and all that kind of stuff, is that the more you meditate on it, so to speak, and free yourself of these other restrictions, then you come closer to understanding it without having to categorize it. That's why I viewed it. You didn't.
I viewed it differently. I viewed it really as he was saying that we've invented. I think he does believe that there is something beyond the world of the senses. I think he does believe that there is some energy at the center.
Explicitly, yeah.
Yes, but what he's saying is that all of our descriptions of it are made up. And that it's not really a god per se. That's just the word we use to describe it.
I think you're saying you're onto something with that, but I think it's just because that's how you have to be able to articulate it.
I guess so.
He's not saying that we've created it. I think he thinks it exists and we're part of it. That we are it and it is us and we're all each other.
True.
And we just have to kind of create our understanding of it as rudimentarily as we can with our limited,
I guess so,
language. And there's a reference at the very end about language and limits of language. I thought of you when I read it.
Yes, well, thank you. Yeah, but I guess you are right. I guess it is more so. I guess. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess it is more of the idea that, not that we've made it up, but that we've made up ways to describe it, and that he doesn't necessarily subscribe to any of the quote-unquote made-up ways that we use to describe God.
He also thinks that when we try to understand it in the wrong way, then we get ourselves further from it.
Yes, and that's what he's saying. That's the next notes I have here.
Oh, look at that segue.
Oh, there you go. He says, our own image of God becomes an obstruction to expressing or experiencing God. He says, the heart must open to the world, and you must believe that you and the other are one, and clinging to the image in our mind obstructs this process. He says, the ultimate mystical goal is to be united with one's God. Your mind must go beyond all concepts and realize that the metaphorical image of God is symbolic of the ultimate mystery of your being. So that's what you were saying there, really connecting that to you and the other are one. We're all part of the same energy. It all goes back to the same source, and really opening up your mind to the idea that everything is one.
Right. And this has always been my fundamental problem with this type of philosophy and in my understanding of Eastern religions or that type of tribal, naturalism, where it's the whole idea is that you try to first understand it intellectually, but then like you're required to not be able to understand it or explain it. You just feel it.
Yeah.
And you experience it through your meditation and and he's usually using psychoaffective drugs or whatever. And so it's like, well, if you can't explain it using words, that's my fundamental disagreement, is that if you can't understand it or explain it purely as an intellectual exercise, then do you really know it?
Yeah.
Does it really exist as you perceive it? Because, I don't think he'd disagree that our senses fail us in understanding this realm.
Yeah.
And so what are we really getting at?
Yeah.
What's the end goal of this whole exercise?
That's the issue that I have with a lot of these ways of thoughts, and this is definitely something we talked about in season 1, but generally philosophies like this, what if we're all part of the same consciousness and this sort of thing? It's like, when you get down to it, if we are, how does that change anything, really? What's the practical aspect of this? And I think Campbell does a better job than most of applying this to like an ethics system and that sort of thing.
Yes.
But where a lot of these philosophies fail, and it kind of goes back to the idea of, what if we're all in a simulation and that sort of thing? We're all sort of a part of the same thing. That's like, if we are, then what does it change? And I think, any system of thought that's just like the ultimate end goal is, okay, so what then? Is like, is it even worth thinking about, in my opinion?
Right. That's the whole idea. What is the end goal of even evaluating this entire system? Is to just and I guess in his view it would be to get understanding of yourself and maybe reorient your life on proper goals, maybe,
Yeah.
because he's talking about following your bliss, which we've already talked about. It's not just seeking pleasure for pleasure's sake. So
Yeah.
I think I think he would say you need to be in tune with the world around you, with the energy, and like a Jedi master.
uh-huh. Yeah, but I mean, it's just so many of these philosophies kind of just go back to like, wouldn't that be crazy? And it's like,
Yeah.
well, yeah.
Right.
What does that change? And I
Right.
think that's the big issue I have with this.
Yeah, it's a practical side of this type of belief system. Okay, so what?
Yeah.
And how does that really? How do you determine what's right or wrong? Because it gets into that, like, love your enemy and all that kind of stuff, and
Yeah, we can get into that a little bit later.
Yeah,
I wanted to
please.
discuss what he says here about how we identify with God and sort of identify with the other.
Yeah.
Because he says that we must go past our own desires and identify with the spiritual principles that our God represents. He points to part of like Hindu teaching that none but a God can worship a God. So to really understand God, we have to acknowledge that we are God. And then Moyers brings up another really good question. He says, in discussing the God within, the Christ within, the illumination or the awakening that comes within, isn't there a danger of becoming narcissistic, of an obsession with self that leads to a distorted view of oneself in the world? Campbell responds, that can happen, of course. That's a kind of short-circuiting of the current, but the whole aim is to go past oneself, past one's concept of oneself, to that of which one is but an imperfect manifestation. When you come out of a meditation, for example, you are supposed to end by yielding all the benefits, whatever they may be, to the world, to all living beings, not holding them to yourself. You see, there are two ways of thinking I am God. If you think I here, in my physical presence and in my temporal character, am God, then you are mad and have short-circuited the experience. You are God not in your ego, but in your deepest being, where you're at one with the non-dual transcendent. So lots of big words there. But I really think, again, he kind of dodges the question almost. Because he says, well, yeah, that line of thinking would lead you to be narcissistic if you think incorrectly.
Correct.
But it's like, fundamentally, if everybody thinks that they have to be God in order to align themselves with God and to understand God, then you're going to run into a lot of issues where everybody thinks that they are God, and it
Right.
will get very narcissistic very quickly.
It reminds me of those people that when you say, communism doesn't work, and they always say, well, just haven't done it right yet. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, Stalin, all the murderers, and Mao, all the murderers, they just haven't perfected it yet. Pure perfection would be really great.
Yeah.
And it seems to be what he's saying here is if you do this meditation thing absolutely right, but then he gets, well, of course, it's not his mission to explain the entire universe and who created what and all that kind of stuff. He said hard talk about mythology and then how a belief system in general will help you. So maybe I'm being a little unfair with him, but these types of philosophies, and it's just a different type of religion.
Yeah.
Yeah, he acts like it's beyond religion because he doesn't want to have the rules.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you don't have a rules, and what good is it? But
Yeah.
you gotta have some sort of guidelines or goalposts or guardrails.
Exactly. Which
or
it seems
something.
like it's what he's trying to set up here without really setting them up. He's saying, well, of course, if you do it incorrectly, you have to consider yourself on the right experience. You're not physically God, but
Right.
mentally and spiritually, sure, you have to identify with God. But it's like,
Right.
well, now you're setting up all sorts of rules and guideposts, like you were
Right.
saying, and it's just becoming another religion. I don't
Right.
see, what sets that apart from
Right.
others.
Agreed.
He then goes on to talk about how we should love our enemies. This is what you were mentioning earlier. And he starts off talking about Jesus in general. He says, we don't know much about Jesus. He says, all we have about him are 4 contradictory texts written after his death.
And he really loves this this other text that is attributed to Thomas. That's
Yeah.
the fifth, supposedly the fifth gospel, because he really likes to quote from that.
Yeah, he really does.
Which I don't, I think it's odd because I don't think it was widely believed. I mean, it's widely followed. And we're talking about mythology, and you'd think that you'd focus on what did people, what did resonate with them? What resonated with them in the gospel or whatever you want to call it of Thomas obviously hasn't. Now you would say, well, because the church suppressed it. Well, I mean, it's been published, so evidently nobody's really interested in it.
It's just strange because I've come across this a few times of people sort of inserting their own opinions about what somebody else's religion should be.
Ooh, yeah,
It's
right,
like,
right. Right.
Who are you to say what the holy books of Christianity are if you hate Christianity? And I'm not saying Campbell hates Christianity,
No, he
but I've seen that in other places. It's like,
Right.
well, you deny these other books, and it's like, well, we've had a couple thousand years of people looking at all these texts and trying to determine, what's morally right and wrong.
Right.
But now you are telling me that my faith is incorrect because it needs this extra book that you like.
Right.
And it's like, I don't know. It just seems it's a disconnect there that I don't really like.
And you know what I really enjoy is, and I think is compelling, is Jordan Peterson's discussions of Christianity. And I don't know that I think he might be an atheist.
He might be.
But he really has an affection for the Christian religion, for what it, for the moral structure of it, and what it teaches you on how to be a good person. And I just think it's fascinating when he talks about it, because he makes so many good points. But then he always comes up to the line of he doesn't believe any of this stuff, but he believes in the story of it. It's an interesting discussion. I don't think he's ever said one way or the other, because I think he backs off against it at the last minute. So Campbell likes to talk about Jesus, and it's always funny because he's like, he talks about how Jesus is just another one of these stories, but then he also has to admit that the story of Jesus is dissimilar in significant ways from every other mythology.
Yeah,
which I think is fascinating, because there are some parallels, to Buddha and all that stuff. But he talks about how all these other ones are kind of humorous or kind of silly or odd, or I think he talks about a trickster or a jokester or whatever, and there's none of that in the Gospels, and that's true. It really is kind of serious, and I would expect he would have had some fun. He couldn't have
that's
been
a
just completely
discussion a little bit later, but Moyers kind of asks him, you tell all these stories with a lot of humor, essentially.
Right.
He says, well, that's... I think he almost frames it as an issue with Christianity and in Judeo-Christian, religions and stuff. He's like, well, in all these other religions, you have the humor added to it, but this is the only one that takes itself completely seriously. And I don't know why that would necessarily be a bad thing.
Correct.
Like, I don't,
Right.
But it's strange. But he goes on to say,
go ahead.
Back to Jesus' teachings, he says, the main teaching of Jesus is love your enemies. And Moyers kind of asks, how do we love our enemy without condoning his aggression? Campbell responds that we do that.
That's such a good question, because that's something that's very important. But go ahead.
Yeah, and he says we do that by recognizing our own faults as well, pointing to the story about remove the stick in your eye before criticizing the splinter in your enemies. He says no one is in a position to disqualify his enemy's way of life. Not that was interesting. I don't know if
It's also wrong. It's 100%
I was about to say.
wrong.
I thought you would have some thoughts.
Yeah, because even of course the famous example of Jesus being mad at the money changers in the temple. I mean, it's not Jesus was not a permissive person.
Yeah.
Because there are still things that are right and there are wrong, but he loved everybody. And he didn't condone. And when like a rich guy wanted to said, "Hey, what do I have to do to get to heaven?" He didn't say you can't get to heaven. He just said, you gotta give away all your stuff.
Yeah.
And he didn't say, "Oh, we're all going to heaven." He said you have to give up all your stuff.
Yeah.
And it went on and on. All these other examples of people who had to do things.
I saw a great, I don't know if it was an interview or something written down, but it was essentially talking about how tolerance is not a virtue. I forget who said it. I think it was we might have talked about this a couple episodes ago. I think it was a Catholic bishop or priest or something like that. And he was saying, tolerance is not a virtue, because we can love our enemies in some ways by criticizing their way of life, by trying to get them to follow a more moral path.
Right.
We should treat them with kindness and with respect, but we do not need to tolerate their way of life if it is immoral.
Right.
And I think that's what Campbell's really getting wrong here, is he's saying, well, Jesus said, don't criticize your neighbor before removing the branch in your eye. But that's not...
It's not exactly what the lesson is. The lesson is about permanent judgment of another person. We're all sinners. We're all sinners. And so, so when he's saying that you can...
he says no one is in a position to disqualify his enemy's way of life.
Yeah, I am. I'm in that position. There are people whose way of life is darn right evil.
Yeah.
They just choose a path of evil, destruction, rape, murder. They've existed all throughout history. They exist today in this state of Missouri.
Yeah.
And so that's just a wrong-headed, a simplistic odd thing for anyone to
Well,
say.
Judge, you can't rule me guilty because I saw you jaywalking the other day. It's like,
Yeah, that's different.
It's-
That's right.
yeah.
It's a matter of degree,
Mhm.
and quite frankly, maybe they're both wrong.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I have to agree with what you did just
Mhm.
because Jesus
just
said,
love your enemies.
love your enemies.
Mm-hmm.
You still love them. It doesn't mean you can condone them or you can't judge their way of life.
Mhm.
Their way of life, what
Yeah.
they're doing, you can condemn.
Yes. Don't
Who
condemn
they
them.
are.
Yes.
But of course I do anyway.
Yeah. Well, yes, of course. He
That's
goes.
that's a struggle. And we all do it.
Mhm.
The most judgmental people in the world are the ones that say, we have to be more tolerant.
Mm.
Yeah.
He goes on to say, which something that I've heard a lot recently. He says that Jesus would not be the kind of Christian that we know today. He says he'd probably be more of a very spiritual monk or nun. He probably would not be the Christian that we see, walking down the street, which is something that I've heard time and time again. Jesus is not your Republican Jesus is one of the things that I hear all the time.
I think it would be fascinating and terrifying if Jesus came back.
Yeah.
Because he's going to judge us.
Yes.
And we're not supposed to judge each other.
Mm-hmm.
That dude's going to judge us.
Yeah.
And is not, I don't think he's going to be very kind about it. He's going to say, hey, you had your warnings. I got crucified and stuff. I had these people write all this stuff down.
Yeah.
You've read it. You had access to it. What the hell are you doing with your life? And he's going to say that to me and to everybody else.
Yeah.
That's scary. That's why I think those fundamentalist Christians that talk about fear of God, I think they are right on it. I used to not, but maybe because I'm getting older and you get a little bit closer to the the pearly gates, so to speak, and you're like, oh my God, man, I should take this a little more seriously.
Yeah.
But
Because there's definitely a notion today of sort of a hippie Jesus, which is somewhat what Campbell's saying. Jesus said love everybody and love your neighbor and that sort of stuff. And it's like, Jesus said some very not pleasant things. Like there's one in particular where he's talking to the crowd about how you must eat his flesh and drink his blood, and that's something that we've heard time and time again in the Bible story. But like going back to the original language of that, it's closer to like gnaw on my body and drink my blood, literally. Like that's literally what those people were hearing. He wasn't saying do this metaphorically and do this spiritually and just love everybody. It's like he was saying some very brutal and very honest things to a lot of people back then. That's one example I can think of, but I mean, it's
well, that's part of the reason why the leadership was so upset with him, because he was revolutionary.
Yeah.
He was a threat to them and their power structure, not because he's saying, hey, let's all get along.
Yeah.
It was a complete revolutionary idea and a challenge to the power structure. And if people think he's just gonna be out there smoking pot and wearing Birkenstocks, I don't think so.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the whole,
I envision in this Sodom and Gomorrah world we live in now, there'd be a lot of smiting.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your arm causes you to sin, cut it off. It's not just.
And he would, that's right. That would be the discussion, and nobody says that stuff now. Stop doing it.
Yeah.
You stop doing the bad stuff.
Yeah.
And you just never hear it. And so I think that's pretty naive or wrongheaded thing to view it. But I think it would be really, really fascinating and entertaining, and like I said, also terrifying if Jesus or God came down here and walked among us, because he would not be happy with any of us. He wouldn't be happy with me either.
No.
He'd be like, oh my gosh. Had a little bit more time. And I don't know. Maybe I'm just personifying it, what I would do if I were him. I think there might be a certain sense of humor about judging people at that point. Well, you asked for it, here it comes. I don't know. You don't.
Yeah, maybe. But he goes on to talk about compassion. Moyers says, "You once took the saying of Jesus, 'Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. You once took this to be the highest, the noblest, the boldest of the Christian teachings. Do you still feel that way?" Campbell responds, "I think of compassion as the fundamental religious experience, and unless that is there, you have nothing." So another sort of framing of compassion there at the center, but also kind of what you were saying as well earlier about how he somewhat praises Christianity in some ways and then denigrates it in others. And this is I think, a pretty clear example of that. This is the highest Christian teaching, and he seems to say that this is really one of the most fundamental religious teachings overall, that idea of compassion. But again, it's, is he talking about hippie Jesus here, or is he talking about Bible Jesus? It's a strange, line to walk on there. Of course, we should treat people with compassion, but at the same time, it's not just love everything your neighbor is doing.
Right, and he talks about that being the fundamental philosophy of a just system, I guess. What other religions really teach that? I mean, I don't know. I mean, the love your neighbor and the focus on compassion I mean, there's other religions I guess I won't name, but they don't have that view. So I don't know.
That is true. He then goes on to talk about life and religion as a whole. He says, one of the highest types of life to live is that of giving oneself to others. He says, this is sourced in the recognition of your life in the other. He says, God is the symbol of that shared life. So this is getting back into sort of how he applies his ethical system into, seeing the other in yourself and that sort of thing. He says,
Is this where he goes on for like 4 pages about the circles and stuff?
Yeah, this is where he talks about that for a little bit. He starts it off, I think.
A little bit.
Yeah, for a lot of bit.
Everything's a circle.
Yeah.
It's like, who was it? The Pythagoreans? The
triangle.
The numerology and the triangles.
The numerology, yeah.
Was it them? And this other religion was a religion of numbers. He's got a religion of circles.
Yeah, but this is... I think, this is what I was saying earlier about how he does a better job of some people than some people of, sort of relating this metaphysical approach to sort of an ethical system here.
True.
In order to live an ethical life, you have to recognize that the other is yourself and, apply that in everything. And you give yourself to the other because the other is you, which, of course, we don't really agree with just based on the metaphysical part of it. But it's an interesting way to apply ethics to it, I think.
I don't like how he kind of surrenders the self so much into the greater blog.
Yeah.
He's very much he would have loved the Borg, from Star Trek. Yeah, if they had a little, I don't even think he'd really care if they had independent thought. It's anybody who hasn't watched the Star Trek episodes with the Borg, well, too bad. But you're all part of the one, and the one, you are one and they are one, and you're all focusing on a single mission of expansion and all that. But it's he really believes or wants to believe that we're all part of the same deity. We're all part of the same God. It's kind of like almost like a fractured piece of glass, shattered into millions of billions of pieces, but we're all glass, and so at the end we're just gonna get melted together.
It's an interesting metaphor, but yeah, good job. He then goes on to talk about what religion has to play in this sort of type of life. He says religion, the word itself, religio, means linking back. It symbolizes the connecting link in all people. He says that's really what religion should do, is to help us find that connecting link. Then he goes on to talk about the circles for a long time, and then the point that he brings up here is that the circle is one of the most common religious symbols. It represents continuous link in many other things, of continuous life, and that's sort of where he's pulling, I think, a lot of the idea that all these religions really go back to linking everybody together, which is true to an extent. Yeah. But once you get into we're all the same person, I think it sort of falls apart.
Right.
And he goes on to talk about why we have common symbols at all between all these different religions.
Yeah.
He says, why did the same images appear across different cultures? And he says here, this speaks for certain powers in the psyche that are common to all mankind. Otherwise, you couldn't have such detailed correspondences. Moyers asks him, so if you find that many different cultures tell the story of creation or the story of a virgin birth or the story of a savior who comes and dies and is resurrected, they are saying something about what is inside us and our need to understand. And he says, that's right. The images of myth are reflections of the spiritual potentialities of every one of us. Through contemplating these, we evoke the powers in our own lives. And so this is really, I think, one of the most concise ways to summarize just about everything he said in this book so far.
Right.
Essentially, the reason why myths are so similar and have so many common tropes and things like that is because they represent something inside of us. And then the purpose of having all these symbols is to contemplate them and recognize these eternal truths within all of us. And I think that's really been his overarching theme throughout this entire book.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure to highlight that there.
Yeah, and I had a little asterisk and underlined it in my book. And I wrestle with this. I've been thinking about it the whole season. Kind of like a chicken and the egg thing. are these themes
Mm-hmm.
within us because they have a certain fundamental power
Mm-hmm.
and reflect what the reality, or is it just a psychological need
Mm-hmm.
for survival that we have to believe in an afterlife? And once you get to
Yeah.
a certain intellectual capacity, if you overthink these things, or you think that the life is the struggle of life, which used to be much worse than
Mm-hmm.
what it is now. If you become self-aware, sometimes the most logical thing is to kill yourself.
Yeah.
But if you have this religious belief beyond that, and you have a religion and these rituals and all that, maybe you're just I guess the question is, sometimes, like you say, people that don't have a religious view, they disparage us because they say, well, you're just saying that because you feel the need to
Yeah, I
believe
know that's
in
like
something.
the Darwinian approach to it, the
Correct.
sort of the evolution. Well, of course, we evolved this sort of the want to have religion because
Yes.
it bonds us together and it
Correct.
helps us build stronger communities and it
Correct.
keeps us, from dying
Yeah.
and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
It's
and
like,
the outliers, didn't survive.
Yeah.
That didn't have this compunction or this need to believe in some sort of spirituality, and he believes that this just means we're all part of the same thing. I think it's probably a little bit of both. Maybe there's some elemental truth that we all kind of understand. I mean, especially if you believe in the religious beliefs that we're created in the image of God. Well, we're going to recognize certain things, and also, maybe there's some physical, reason for us to believe in some kind of general themes, or like there's all sorts of human development, like child development, where you're drawn to certain images or colors, as you develop and stuff like that. So
I don't know if I necessarily believe the evolutionary, approach to it, because it's just, I don't know, it just seems so improbable to me because it's so far removed from any other animal, really. Because like to really get there, even to be able to understand religion at all, you have to have, language, and you have to have the mental capacity and everything before that, and then to go from there to looking and wondering and realizing that there's something else out there. I don't know. It just seems so unbelievable that would happen just by chance. Do you know what I mean? You look perplexed.
No, I'm thinking about what you're saying.
Yeah.
It was me being thoughtful.
Contemplative.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Contemplative.
Yeah, I don't know. It's...
Yeah. Good thoughts.
Thank you. He then goes on to say that the ultimate elementary idea of man is God. That's the basic, most primal need that we all have, is to create some sort of God. And he goes on to talk about, what does this belief system have for people of different religions? And he tells this story. He says, when I started teaching comparative mythology, I was afraid I might destroy my students' religious beliefs. But what I found was just the opposite. Religious traditions, which didn't mean very much to them, but which were the ones their parents had given them, suddenly became illuminated in a new way when we compared them with other traditions where similar images had been given a more inward or spiritual interpretation. I had Christian students, Jewish students, Buddhist students, a couple of Zoroastrian students. They all had this experience. There's no danger in interpreting the symbols of a religious system and calling them metaphors instead of facts. What that does is to turn them into messages for your own inward experience and life. The system suddenly becomes a personal experience.
I think that's 100% true.
You think so?
Yes, with regard to religious symbolism, because, well, of course, Catholic Church is just has gobs of them. I mean, the symbols in any decent church, there's going to be a million.
Yeah.
From the stained glass to the crucifix to the altar, the what do you call the thing where they put the hosts in?
The monstrance?
Monstrance.
Oh, that's or the tabernacles. What
Tabernacles, actually.
The monstrance is the big fancy one that they use for adoration.
Oh, yeah, it is monstrous. And even those, like I just bought a little cross necklace, or it has little designs on them, like the Celtic cross has different designs. I mean, there's symbols everywhere, and I think that's part of the problem with religious education is that you don't delve into that stuff, and you just kind of like you have a routine, or it's there, you don't even think about it. But I think that, I'm encouraged by his experience that when he goes into those metaphors and religious symbols, and explains, hey, there's some meaning behind these things, And these are the general meanings, and they're similar to the meaning that other people have in their religions.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm encouraged that people then would not lose their religious faith, but maybe be encouraged by, hey, there's something more there.
Yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense to me that would happen.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, I was watching, it was today, I was eating a sandwich or whatever, and they had a documentary about Route 66. And this is going to go off on the sidetrack.
That's all right.
But you know what? There's a lot of stuff that went through the state of Missouri, and so there's a lot of locations within the state of Missouri that were on Route 66, and some of them are still there.
Mm-hmm.
And you drive by them, you want to think about them, but they have a historical significance, modern historical significance. You don't even think about what it meant at the time when those buildings were there and prominent. And then you go back further in history. It's I think the more you know about what's going on in your religion or your history of your community, the more you appreciate what you have. And I'm encouraged by that, and I think that's true.
Mm-hmm.
I think those religious symbols and practices and traditions are so important to know about those things, because there's a reason why we're doing them. There's a reason why they did it 1,000 years or 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
We're doing a very similar thing, and if you just do it, you don't really believe it.
Yeah.
You know?
I agree to an extent, because I think that's absolutely 100% true when it comes to religious symbols themselves. But I think Campbell goes a step further.
He does.
He says everything in the religion is a symbol.
True.
And so when I think you get to that point, then it's kind of denying all of the religions at once. Yeah. And I don't think it would really deepen your faith to hear somebody tell you the symbol of Jesus is just the same as the symbol of Buddha. And so it's all just symbolism.
They're not buying what he's selling.
Yes.
You know, they get the marketing. It's like he's saying all this is all marketing.
Yeah.
You know, but then when they look at the marketing, they're like, that is a good product. You know, that's really what's happening. Because he's saying, oh, this is a bunch of bullshit. You just need to meditate. We're all part of the same God, and you're a God, and I'm a God, and everybody's in the classroom, and all the Jews are like, I don't think that's true, you know? I don't think the Christians, I don't think these Zoroastrian people, nope, that doesn't sound right to me. So it seems like he wasn't converting people like he feared he would, which I think it speaks volumes about that he's a good person.
Yeah, I'm glad.
And that he did not really want to destroy people's faith, which I think, I think it just sends, I think it seems to me that in this conversation he's a really good person.
Yes.
I'm criticizing some of his views, and I don't mean to be attacking him personally. But I could see how he would be worried about that. He'd be like, I don't want to destroy their faith and make them miserable and, and all that, take them away from their church or their belief system. But I think it's encouraging that he didn't teach them all. He's not an atheist, but
because this is definitely something that he absolutely believes. The energies and everything. And I was really glad to see that he wasn't the type of guy to have the students come into his classroom and say, okay, this is what is true,
right?
And then this is what you have to believe now. But I think you're absolutely right that it helped them sort of see the symbolism behind everything, which is good.
Yep.
It then goes on to talk about strife. I thought this was an interesting discussion here.
Yeah.
He says, strife is the creator of all great things. He says, strife appears with trickster deities, the serpent in the garden, etc. It pops up in mythology after mythology. He says, systems of thought can't include boundless life. There needs to be an element of strife for anything to happen.
Yeah.
So he says, in every mythology, it's not just everything's perfect and everything is fine and great. It's, there's always the element of somebody introducing some sort of sin or some sort of, mistake or strife or anything like that would cause problems. But really, we have to have those problems in order to reach something bigger. Yeah. Really, we have to have that first and foremost, which I think is very true.
Yeah, it is true of human nature. If we're all comfortable, nothing's going to get done.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of a capitalist system, because there's always this never-ending competition. There's just one business goes under, but the other one excels, and that kind of what they call creative destruction. There's a lot of truth to that. And, he talks about the myth, the trickster gods doing different things and throwing chaos in. If you don't have some sort of chaos or violence, there's no change and nothing happens. You're just all stagnant.
True.
Yep.
He goes and he talks about peak experiences and epiphanies. This was interesting here.
And know he's a runner.
Yes, he is a runner. But he
He
says
had the perfect run
Yes.
twice.
says there's kind of two types of events that you'll experience in your life to help you have like a deeper spiritual understanding. The first of which is a peak experience, and that is a moment when you experience your relationship to the harmony of being. His example that he gave, he was running a race, a relay, I guess. He was one of the anchors, and he just knew that he was going to win. He knew he was in last when he got the baton, but he knew he was going to win that race, which was an interesting example to give, just knowing...
Yeah, I was surprised by his example, yeah.
But just knowing what your place is within everything else. He knew his place in that moment was to win that race, and he was going to win that race, which is an interesting thing. I don't know if that's something that you've ever experienced, or... Because we're both runners. I don't know if we've ever said that on the podcast.
Well, you were a runner.
I was a runner, yeah. I have not been running in a while.
Old fat jogger. Not while running, but I've had good runs where you feel that peace. I'm struggling to get back to that because I've gotten so out of shape that it's more of work.
Yeah.
But I think I mentioned to you a couple runs ago. I actually had a little leg in there where I was able to not concentrate on just getting my one foot in front of the other, actively, and then you can kind of zone out and just get your pacing going. I related, I don't know if it's true, but I related to his experience. I had a couple trials that were really tough trials, and everything just fell into place.
Yeah.
I anticipated everything the other side was going to do. My from the beginning to the end of the trial, everything just fell my way, and it just felt like I was in the zone. And everything kind of slowed down for me, so I could anticipate objections, and I think I know what he was talking about.
I feel like I've had similar stuff when like playing music, because it's like, sense. Especially when you're improvising something, just kind of noodling around, you don't know what you're going to do next. It just kind of happens. Yeah. You press the right notes and it sounds good. And I think that's really sort of what he's talking about here. He doesn't know, how he's going to run, but he knows that he's going to win, essentially.
No, it's a better analogy than mine. Yeah.
Then he goes on to talk about epiphanies, which he says are aesthetic experiences of the harmonious rhythms of relationships. So how this differs from peak experiences, at least it seems to me, the peak experience is knowing where you are in relation to everything else. And then the epiphany is kind of realizing the relationship of everything else around you, of the whole world, essentially. The peak experience is more personal. And he says that it can be felt when seeing something beautiful or something sublime or monstrous. I thought this was an interesting conversation that he had here about what the sublime is. He says that the sublime is a presence that explodes your standards for harmony, order, and ethical conduct. And one of the examples that he points to is Vishnu, the Hindu destroyer god, leaving the universe in ash. And he also points to World War II, when they saw the invading Germans and just knowing that they were going to take over the position and that sort of thing. It was not beautiful, but it was sublime. And you could look at it with some sort of wonder, some sort of, I don't know if fear is the right word, but some sort of understanding of the relationship between everything is what he's really saying here.
Well, yes. It reminded me of Apocalypse Now, the movie. Ever see that movie? It's bizarre. I have not. It's bizarro. It's very violent. But there's a scene where there's a raid on an enemy position set in the Vietnam War, and it's a Stanley Kubrick movie, I believe. And anyway, there's a scene where they're firing. There's a helicopter attack, and they play over their headsets, "Flight of the Valkyries." Dun, 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 dun. Yes. And it's been mocked and parodied a million times since then, but they're firing incendiaries and murdering people, and it's just a sublime scene in the movie. I mean, you're kind of horrified by it, but it's also has its own, you wouldn't say beauty, but
I guess sublimeness is the right word. We don't really have a word for that.
Yeah, well, it's terrible beauty. Yeah, is really what it is, I mean, if you look at like those nuclear explosions at was it Bikini Atoll where they did the testing where nobody died. Yeah. It's not beautiful, but it's something. And it's just the awesome power of it. So I get what he's saying, that it's not beautiful, maybe sublime, because there's some power, some elemental. I don't know if you'd say attraction, but fascination maybe with it.
And he says, he has this interesting quote here when he talks about sort of ethics when relating to things that are sublime. He says, ethics is wiped out. Whereas in our religions with their accent on the human, there's also an accent on the ethical. God is qualified as good. No, God is horrific. Any God who can invent hell is no candidate for the Salvation Army. The end of the world, think of it. But there is a Muslim saying about the angel of death. When the angel of death approaches, he is terrible. When he reaches you, it is bliss. And he kind of goes on to talk about this in terms of ethics. He says, the sublime allows us to cut away the binding ego of self, and sort of, start again, start anew, and that sort of thing, while focusing on the relationship of everything else. But I just thought the way he phrased things here was interesting.
Yeah,
I thought you might have
discussion.
some thoughts on his idea that God is horrific because he invented hell.
Well, yeah, I would expect he would think that. It depends on what hell is, I guess. We won't know until we get there, so to speak.
Yeah.
But he doesn't like a judgmental God. And I would say that man is horrific, and God's just dealing with it.
Yeah.
I mean, if he didn't make us do whatever the hell we've been doing down here. But yeah, he doesn't like there to be an absolute good, and he likes the moral equivalency.
Yeah.
Seems to me
That is true.
it's like we can't judge anybody. Okay, well,
That is true.
I guess I'll just put a bullet in your head, and nobody will judge me for it. I mean, what are we gonna do?
Yeah.
We have to make judgments.
He has a very confusing discussion, I thought, about eternity after this, which I couldn't really wrap my mind around, because he says
Well, I
whatever.
think he was talking about a lot of the stuff we talked about in previous seasons.
Yeah, maybe.
What's eternity and everlasting? Outside of time.
Yeah, because he
Outside of
says
the physical time.
whatever eternity is here now. He says it's essentially it has to be by its nature of being eternal. It has to be here now. He says we must experience eternity now, for we won't experience it in heaven, because heaven is unending time, not eternal.
Right.
Eternal is beyond time.
Yes.
Which is strange to think about, because I think I've always flipped those two. I've always thought of heaven as being beyond time, because God is beyond time and that sort of thing, and not that heaven is unending time. But he seems to think this is all going back to his sort of religion of introspection and everything you have to achieve, understanding of the eternal right now, in order to live a fulfilling and meaningful life.
I don't think he's saying anything different than you are. He just uses different words.
Maybe.
That's the way I viewed it.
Maybe.
Maybe I just didn't understand it.
But yeah, it's an interesting discussion, because
it's an important discussion to figure out what happens,
because
how
that's
you deal with eternity and
that's what the chapter title is all about, the masks of eternity, and that's really what he's saying here, because eternity is so hard to grasp, but because it is right now, those are the masks that we have to put on it to understand it. That's why we have deities and divinities, is because we have to find a way to understand eternity.
True.
Then he talks about ethics a little bit more.
Yeah.
He says, ethics is a way of teaching you how to live as though you were one with the other. He says, ethics has a place in mythology in teaching how to live the mythological idea that you and the other are one. Which is essentially what I've been saying, but he really says it just explicitly here, because Moyers asks him, where does ethics fit in here?
Right.
Because you've talked about, mythology helps us metaphysically to understand that you and the other are one. But then he says, ethics is
Do you really think the mythology generally says you and the other are one?
No.
Yeah, I don't really see that in mythology. Maybe I'm missing. Of course, he talks about kind of the yin and yang, and there's always a good and a bad. And there's twins, and but I don't. Because I'm not an expert, but does all these other myths and mythology really say that we're all the same? I don't.
Never explicitly, as far as I know. But I think his reasoning is, of course, going back to, there's the common tropes and everything, and a lot of the moral teachings are along the lines of, compassion and love your neighbor as yourself. There has to be an underlying idea there that we are all part of the same thing.
I think that's really unique to
you think
Christianity.
So?
If you think about the Greek gods,
well,
you think about Egyptian stuff. We had the whole last season, all these different gods, Chinese myths.
I guess it would be
African tales.
Yeah.
I don't know that we have the Native American they didn't think that they were all the same. They
Yeah.
thought they had some sort of spiritual connection to the animals and plants and the Gaia or whatever.
I guess the closest, like,
But we're all separate individuals.
well, the most direct thing that I think he would point to here is the idea of reincarnation. I would assume so, in that, we are reincarnated into another human or another being, but we're all the
that's still
same.
the same. That's the same individual, and every individual is different, though, right?
I guess so.
Because you just have all these millions of different individuals getting reincarnated, and maybe you'd never fully die, but you're not the same as me, and I'm not the same as the listener. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think the mythology, these other myths, support what he's talking about here.
Not explicitly, but
I don't think implicitly.
you don't think so?
I don't think any implicits.
I can see where he gets. All right, I can see where he draws the idea from, but it's a lot of
It's a leap of
based
faith.
on something else, based on something else, based on something else. It's very far removed, I think, from the stories themselves.
Truth.
He then talks about mortality,
Yes.
and he told an interesting story here about the Buddha. He says there was a story of the Buddha who encountered a woman who had just lost her son, and she was in great grief. The Buddha said, "I suggest that you just ask around to meet somebody who has not lost a treasured child or husband or relative or friend. Understanding the relationship of mortality to something in you that is transcendent of mortality is a difficult task." He says myths are full of stories about seeking immortality, but he says this is really a metaphor for identifying that which is of eternity is in your own life now. There's a lot of words to say. Essentially, he's saying all these stories about seeking immortality are really about seeking the God within you and that sort of stuff. Right. But I did like his story about the Buddha there, saying, we do have to come to terms with mortality. People will die and that sort of stuff, and that's really a driving force of a lot of mythologies.
I think it really is, the lesson there is that you should not hire Buddha as a grief counselor. Oh, you're sad your child died a horrible, disfiguring death? Well, you know what? Susie's grandma died last week, and she was 92 years old, so buck up, buttercup. I mean, we all die sometime.
Yeah.
Who does that?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a grieving woman. Maybe console her a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, we'll all die sometime.
Your time will be here eventually.
Why don't you ask around? Why don't you go between your sobs? Go ask your neighbors. Hey, have you had anybody that died? Yes. Was it a child? No. Yeah. What is that discussion? And what's the lesson that he's taking from that?
The lesson, I guess, is that we have to accept that people die. Yeah. But I mean, I think giving her a little bit of a grieving period is good.
I think Jesus dealt with that. Of course, with Lazarus, he rose him.
Yeah.
But because Jesus was compassionate. Mm-hmm. Buddha didn't give a rat's ass, right? Quit your crying, woman. Get back to work. Jesus raised the dude from the dead because he felt so bad for the grieving mother, right? Isn't that the story?
Yeah, that is true.
Isn't that the story? Though,
well, I don't know. It's because he felt bad for her.
Yes.
Well, I mean,
in her grief, she was so sorrowful. He raised the dude from the dead.
But she asked because she had faith that he was Jesus.
Well, true.
Yes,
true. That's true too. But he didn't say, "Hey, you know what? You need to go ask around. Everybody's dying." Right? It was like a plague. I had 2 lepers come up to me yesterday, for crying out loud. They're everywhere. They're disgusting.
All right. It then talks about.
I think we should write a script of cynical Jesus.
I think that's a bad idea.
Where he does all the same stuff, but he has a slightly cynical take on it.
Fine, if you really want me to, I could raise Lazarus. Yeah. I mean, you didn't ask me about the 2 dead lepers last week. Shows where your priorities are.
No, not like that. Like where he like the lady's crying or whatever. Mm-hmm. Yeah, these lepers yesterday. They're disgusting. So I cured them. Uh-huh. They're really happy now. I don't know.
All right.
There's something there. There's something there. I don't know what it is. Blasphemy, something like that.
Probably. He then talks about being versus becoming. And I thought this was another interesting bit of philosophy here. He says, we are always becoming more than what we were. We are never fully, totally being. He says the whole question of life revolves around this, essentially. How do we achieve full being, just to be? And he says art helps us see through the fragmented becoming and see the full power of original being. He says ultimate being is beyond human experience, and despite being unable to describe God, which is the source of ultimate being, we still try to describe this experience. Which is another interesting part of his, sort of all the energies are one. But I think there is some truth in this one, more so than in others. At what point am I fully me? Does that make sense? Because,
Yes.
I'm different than I was last year, and I'll be different in 2 years than I am now. And it's like, which one of those is...
Well, he also assumes that we're getting more
Mm-hmm.
into being, where we could be backsliding.
You think so?
But yeah, I mean, if you don't contemplate these
Mm-hmm.
things, you don't really think about stuff, you're not going to get any... Like, say... Well, like for instance, you could have studied philosophy in college and then just kind of start thinking about it for like 20 years.
Who would do that?
I don't know. So I don't buy into that either. But yeah, I mean, well, and then are you the same person? And what if you did something 20 years ago? Are you still responsible for it? It's interesting because you're really not the same person. What about those guys that've been in prison for 20, 25 years?
Yeah.
Have you ever seen Shawshank Redemption?
I don't think I have.
We got to see that.
I've seen that. Yeah. Yeah, but
It's one of the characters in there for a long time.
Yeah.
And then finally he kind of comes to terms with it.
But it is an interesting question. At what point are you fully you? And I don't know if
You're
there is
always you.
You think so?
Yeah, unless your name is Hugh. Then you're Hugh. I am Hugh.
That's a really bad joke. Thank you for that.
You're you. I am me.
He then...
I am Hugh.
Oh my God. He then starts talking about what the purpose of life is. And you have an interesting answer to this. He says that sheer life itself cannot have a purpose. Each individual incarnation has its own purpose, essentially. He says each life has a potentiality, and the purpose of that life is to achieve that potentiality. So he says it's really different for everybody, which is
your best you.
Be your best you. But he frames it in an interesting way. There is... It almost like he's saying that there is a certain plan for you, a certain potential you that you can be. And of course, this is all, relates back to the being versus becoming. And I guess is he would say the purpose of life is to become that ultimate form of being that you can possibly be, your utmost potential being.
Yes, and I think that he reminds me of a school librarian's cat posters. Like with the little kitty cat struggling to get up on the step, and it has like a saying underneath it, like "Be the best you can do." Be the best you can be.
Yeah.
Overcome obstacles and strive to be.
Well, do you
better.
think? That'd be a great poster. The word
I just
be
mentioned
50
like
times.
4.
Yes.
I mentioned like 4.
I've envisioned it all as one long run-on sentence.
Are you familiar with those cat posters?
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about. But do you agree that everybody's purpose of life is different, or do you think that there is one unifying purpose of life?
What do you think?
I think I might agree with him to an extent, in that everybody does have their own unique purpose, and everybody's... I don't know. It's because it's like your purpose is different, but I don't know if the meaning of life is different. I think, there is one unified goal, maybe one unified purpose, and everybody's purpose goes towards that, if that makes sense.
I think it makes sense. I don't know the answer to what the purpose is.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we all have talents, and I think we should have goals, and I think we should strive to be good and to do better as we go on through life. But I don't know what the purpose of life is.
I don't think we'll ever answer that question.
Well, somebody's going to tell us.
Who's going to tell us?
God.
Maybe.
Or not. Or you'll just die, and it'll be like blowing out a match.
Yeah, that's rough.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'm not being stupid.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, do you know what the purpose of life is?
Not yet.
You think you're going to know?
It's going to be me. I'm going to solve it. I'm going to solve that problem.
There's a lot of people have theories.
Yeah. I don't know.
I'm talking about knowing what the purpose of life is.
Yes. I don't think anybody will ever get there. Maybe that is the purpose of life, for everybody to try to find the purpose of life.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, maybe.
Especially if like your purpose in this life.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really what we're all striving. What is your purpose?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what he's saying here,
Yeah.
that everybody has their own purpose, their own
Yeah.
potentiality that they can achieve.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
The last thing that he discusses in this book overall is metaphors. Of course, he says everything is a metaphor. He says the kingdom of God is not an event to come. It is already here. The kingdom of God, the end of the world, whatever you want to call it, he says, is an event of psychological transformation in seeing that all is one. But then Moyers kind of asks, how does one worship, love, and die for a metaphor? And he says, Campbell kind of dodges this one too, I think.
Mm-hmm.
He says here, that's all part of the mystery of life. The world is right there all around us. We just have to experience it. And that's kind of how we die for that metaphor, is to go past the metaphor is really what he's saying here.
Right.
He says we must eventually break past language and metaphors and just experience everything.
Yep.
And that's really what he's talking about. Again, the being versus becoming. We just need to experience life as a whole. And I just wanted to read the last few.
Kind of sounds like a cult leader.
Yeah.
And this is his like pitch to get the girl naked.
Yeah.
It's beyond words,
Yeah.
honey. It's beyond language.
Yeah, the last few
We just have to strive to be one.
the last few lines of the book, Moyer says, the meaning is essentially wordless, meaning the meaning of life. And Campbell says, yes, words are always qualifications and limitations. Moyer says, and yet, Joe, all we puny human beings are left with is this miserable language, beautiful though it is, that falls short of trying to describe. Campbell says, that's right, and that's why it is a peak experience, to break past all that every now and then and to realize, and those are the last lines of The Power of Myth. Interesting there where he mentions language as almost being an obstacle. And I think there's
Absolutely.
there's some truth to that.
Sure.
We've talked about this before, and how do we describe God? If we're really describing God, we're in a way placing, limitations on God, because he's so far beyond everything. And that's kind of what he says here, but he's really applying it to all of life. How do we
Correct.
find the meaning, when we're surrounded by these limitations and we just have to break through and experience it? I think
you
there
just
is...
gotta sit in a dark room and go, just like that. Very good.
Thank you. But I think there's a certain amount of truth there in that, oh my God. And, that at some point, we could talk about it all we want, and we can try to describe it and everything, but I think there is some truth that at some point you just have to kind of sit there and exist almost, whether that's in prayer or meditation or what have you. But I think that is an important part of every religion, just to sit there and be with God.
True. And the flip side of that is you also have to do good things.
Yes. Well, of
You
course.
And sometimes you just don't even think about it.
Yeah.
You just do it and say, let God sort it out. I just need to do the right thing. This is like the exact opposite of what he's talking about. Just pure action. It's a combination of all of it, I think.
Yeah.
I don't think it's this separating yourself from the reality of life.
Yeah.
You have to embrace it. You're in it, and the answer is not we're all the same.
Yeah.
I know that
Mm-hmm.
because we're not all the same, but the answer is going to be that we all have an intrinsic value, and that nobody has a different intrinsic value. Now, we might have different talents or skills or whatever the case may be, but the value of all of us are the same.
Yeah.
That's my thoughts.
That's
on it.
interesting. Well, that was The Power of Myth. We have covered all of it, every chapter. What'd you
Yes.
think overall? What were
What'd
your
you
thoughts?
think? Now
What did I
you're always
think?
asking me. This
Yeah.
is towards the end of the
This is
episode.
the
It's
end of the
time for
episode.
you to
Time for
say.
talk. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed just about all of it. Very, very insightful, very interesting. It's points of view that I hadn't really heard before
Right.
so much. I'd heard similar things, different philosophies. Yeah, I love everybody. But he explains it, Campbell does, in a way that's much better than I've heard anybody else explain these types of theories. And I think he supports it much more than anybody else than just, do good and feel good and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
But it's he's a very smart man. I'm glad we read this.
Yeah.
I really am.
He definitely has a philosophy, a consistent philosophy that underlines the whole system.
Absolutely.
And that's hard to do,
Yeah.
especially when he's kind of melding together all these other things. But but he's honest about it, and I think he recognizes the weaknesses of it.
Yeah.
And he just powers through.
True.
Good stuff.
Yeah. Well, we have to decide what we're going to do next time, next season. This was a short season. It was actually the perfect length. This is the last episode before I go back off to college.
That's right.
We were recording this with my room in more disarray than usual. Well, I don't know. It might be cleaner. It might be cleaner than it is right now. The mattress of my bed is on the floor because my bed has already been moved up to college. And
we're going to throw this thing away.
Are we?
Oh, yeah. We dismember it.
The laptop is on a folding chair, and everything's strewn all over the place. But make sure to shoot us suggestions for what we should read next time. I think we'll take, I don't know how long of a break we'll take.
I'm going to try to pick this one.
You're going to try to pick this one?
You picked the last two, I think.
Yes, I did.
Much.
I did.
And I've been thinking long and hard. I'm getting closer to. I have to find the book.
Are you thinking political? Thinking philosophical?
I am kind of thinking either political or ethics. But I'm thinking political. I want to be a little more practical in this.
More practical? Okay.
Political theory.
Political theory.
That's what I was thinking.
I like what you're thinking.
Yeah. Just because...
but people can still shoot us suggestions at our Twitter, at ULMTD Opinions. I'll put out a tweet whenever we decide on what book we'll be reading. I'll let our millions of fans...
while we figure it out.
That's usually what we've done between seasons, is take a week off, and then we'll be back in 2 weeks.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Yep. Yeah. Give me some time to get moved in up there and everything, and we'll see what we cover next time.
Nice.
All right. Well, this has been, I almost forgot, this has been Season 3, Episode 9 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
Still got to
for the time being.
For the time being, for eternity?
No, just for the time being.
Just for the time being. Yeah. You won't always be Mark Bishop?
Well, if I'm extinguished at my death, no, I will cease to exist as
like
Mark
the
Bishop.
match.
Yes.
Bleak.
Yeah. Well, I found out today another lawyer I know, not well, died. And it's starting to bother me. Of course, I'm getting the age, I'm 52, that more people I know are dying. But it's like they're, especially the smaller legal practices, well, even the larger ones, because they're just a cog in a larger firm. When they die, it's like it just goes poof, like their practice.
Yeah,
their business just disappears into the ether as if they never existed.
That's really awful.
I know. I wonder what the hell I'm doing with my life.
We can look forward to more of that in Season 3 or Season 4, I guess. That was wonderful thing to look forward to next season.
Think about maybe we'll have a season about death. Death, depression, and some other D.
Death, depression, and I don't know.
All I could think of was his dogs. I like dogs.
That's good. That's a free podcast idea out there for anybody who wants it. Death, depression, and dogs.
D cubed. Is it cubed? 3 of them?
Yes.
3. D cubed.
Yes. Fantastic.